On today's episode, I'll go over all the Blackhawks options leading up to the 2023 NHL Draft as just one final reminder, and I'll also break down whether Brayden Yager could be the selection at number 19. All that and plenty more right here on Locked On Blackhawks.
You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everyone? Welcome on in to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today is Monday, June 26th. I'm your host, Jack Bushman. Check me out on Twitter at JackBushman2, or you could also go and check out my Strictly Blackhawks account at Talkin' Hockey for all the latest Blackhawks news and updates. And also just a reminder that you could subscribe for free on YouTube and also follow along for free wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. Make sure to go and do that real quick, folks. I greatly appreciate all of the support out there. And also that way you can get the latest episode as soon as it becomes available each and every day. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. As always, thank you all for joining me on another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, your one-stop shop for all things Chicago Blackhawks. Thank you all for making the show your very first listen here to start off your day. Although this is the second episode that I'm dropping here on Monday afternoon. This was initially supposed to be the first episode that was coming out sometime in the early afternoon. But of course, I was interrupted by the announcement of the Blackhawks landing forwards Taylor Hall and Nick Foligno from the Boston Bruins earlier today. Make sure to go and check out my breakdown of that trade. I think most of us Blackhawks fans, I hope all of us can agree, it seems like a no-brainer win for many different reasons, and that's exactly what I broke down in that episode that I dropped earlier this afternoon. So make sure to go and check that out if you haven't done so already, and make sure to go and smash that subscribe button as I'm on the road to 1,000 subscribers and would love to hit that before the Blackhawks select Connor Bedard with the first overall selection on Wednesday night. But speaking of the 2023 NHL Draft, we are, of course, just 2 days away, getting into my final NHL Draft coverage here before all the fun begins. And what I wanted to go over on the show here today was just kind of one last reminder of all the Blackhawks options leading up to the first round of the 2023 NHL Draft. They, of course, hold 2 selections at this point in time. Most importantly, they got number 1. They will be picking Connor Bedard. Don't let anyone else tell you differently. Don't be scared that the Blackhawks are going to screw this up. This is absolutely happening. Connor Bedard will be the first overall selection. But after that happens, that's where it gets a little bit more interesting for the Blackhawks, because they do have several options of what they could possibly do. And I expect Kyle Davidson to remain aggressive as we've seen him for most of his tenure as Blackhawks general manager so far. I expect him to keep pressing the envelope leading up to day one here on Wednesday. And I wouldn't be shocked or surprised, whatever you want to call it, would not doubt the Blackhawks wind up making a move. One thing I will say, though, leading up to the draft, folks, is while there have been reports of numerous amount of teams wanting to try and trade up, with the Chicago Blackhawks obviously being one of them, just with not only the high-end prospects that are slated to go somewhere, in the top 5 or the top 10, but also just how deep this draft class is overall. Because of that, there really aren't a whole lot of teams that are wanting to move back at this point in time, and we haven't seen really, I know we still have 2 days to go, but we haven't heard about really any deals rumored to be going down, and it just doesn't feel like, and again, things can change, but there hasn't been a whole lot of willing participants to trade back in the first round of one of the deepest NHL drafts that we've seen in quite some time. So, which, at the end of the day does make sense. And that kind of leads me to believe the trades that we will see happening won't necessarily involve draft capital. Now, there will still be deals that do, of course, but I think most of them, especially in the first round where the major moves are, going to be made as the best players get taken in the first round, obviously, I think a lot of the trades that are going to happen this year are going to be are going to be a result of not having very much financial wiggle room, not having a lot of cap space at this point in time. And that's where we really see teams having to make these tough decisions because obviously, like I just said, a very deep NHL draft, no one wants to trade down. You want to get a really special player, but at the same time, you got to think about how you can help your team moving forward and all the moves you want to make in free agency. If you want to bring UFAs or RFAs back, there's just not a whole lot of wiggle room out there across the entire NHL, except if you're Kyle Davidson and the Chicago Blackhawks. That's why we saw them get such a good return for only giving up Ian Mitchell and Alec Regula with the Boston Bruins. It's because the Blackhawks have a lot of cap space and the Bruins don't have very much. So if the Blackhawks do wind up making a move in the first round of the 2023 NHL draft, I expect it to be as a result of a team needing to shed some salary and the Blackhawks taking on that contract rather than just kind of swapping draft picks, because a lot of the teams too, now there are outliers, but a lot of these teams have a decent amount of draft capital and aren't willing to, trade back a few spots just for a second round pick. So it's going to be fascinating, of course, to see how it all works out and how everything is going to go down these next couple of days, because it's the NHL draft. There are always moves going to be made, but I will say at this point in time, it is a little bit quiet, and we might not see as many as we've seen in years past just because this is such a talented first round in 2023. But getting into all of the Blackhawks options here leading up to day one, obviously the one that's been talked about the most is the possibility of them trading up from number 19. But as I just referenced, it's kind of hard to find a willing partner right now because picking in the teens in this year's draft is really like picking in, the latter half of the top 10 in last year's NHL draft, which was not very deep. There aren't a lot of teams that want to just pass up taking those types of players. But again, I think the teams that are going to wind up trading back are teams that are doing so because they have to shed salary and just don't really have a choice financially. So the first team that I think is interesting is the Washington Capitals with the 8th overall selection. Now, I'll admit this one's not very likely. I don't think whatsoever, because 8 is just a really high selection. And for the Blackhawks to move up 11 spots, that's a pretty big gap in this year's NHL draft. And while the Capitals do have a player that I think they'd be willing to trade if the price were right, I don't know if falling back from all the way from number 8 to number 19 would make a lot of sense. The Blackhawks might have to sweeten the pot in order to move up that much, but that's where it gets interesting. Who kind of budges first? Is it, the Chicago Blackhawks, who might have to give up a little bit more in order to do this? Or is it the Washington Capitals, who know they're in a tough spot and have to shed salary? That's kind of the chess match that's going to be played out throughout the NHL draft. But I think Anthony Mantha is the one player that the Washington Capitals have on their books right now that they'd probably be willing to move on from. He hasn't had a very successful tenure since coming over from the Detroit Red Wings. Still has 1 year left on his current deal at $5.7 million. Now, again, I don't necessarily know if the Blackhawks are going to be able to get something done in order for them to move up to number 8. But I did just recently hear a kind of a interesting deal that was laid out by Charlie Roumeliotis on the Blackhawks Talk podcast. Shout out to Charlie, James, Pat Boyle, all those guys. Charlie, of course, is a recurring guest here on the podcast. Love all the great work that they do. Charlie outlined a deal potentially involving Mantha, where the Blackhawks trade up in the second round. They jump up from number 66, I think it was, all the way up to number 40. And as a result, they take on Anthony Mantha's deal with 1 year left at $5.7 million. I think that would make more sense, certainly, than the Blackhawks jumping all the way up from number 19 to number 8. Not sure how willing Washington would be in order to make a move like that happen. The one that does, make a lot of sense, and this is a team that has been brought up in a lot of rumors with the Blackhawks this offseason. I've said it's almost felt like they were meant to make a deal at some point here. That's obviously the Vancouver Canucks, who have the 11th overall selection. Now, since I kind of have talked about a potential marriage between the Blackhawks and Canucks this summer, they have since bought out defenseman Oliver Ekman-Larsson, which does give them a little bit more cap flexibility this season, but really does put them in a hurt moving forward. I mean, I think he's still on their books for 6 or 7 years from now. It's not going to be a very good deal for the Canucks. But they do still have 2 players who have been brought up in numerous trade rumors this offseason, and Brock Besser and Connor Garland. Personally, I think Brock Besser is the one that the Blackhawks would be more intrigued by, considering he only has 2 years left on his current deal compared to Connor Garland having 3. Now, on the flip side, Garland's AAV is only $4.95 million, while Besser's is 6.65. But based on everything we've seen from Kyle Davidson, I really don't think he wants to be having many contracts, if any. It's only Seth Jones and Connor Murphy at this point signed on for longer than 2 years. So while Garland's kind of been the one who's been thrown around there more, I quite honestly think Brock Besser would be the one the Blackhawks would rather have, just because that extra year. It seems like it's been a big thing for Kyle Davidson all offseason. And one thing for Vancouver to keep in mind, too, is they don't have a second-round pick in this year's draft. So while moving up from number 19 to number 11 might be a pretty hefty leap, the Blackhawks are also going to take salary off their books, and I wouldn't be surprised if they threw in one of their later second-round picks. And there may be some of you saying, well, that's an awful lot for the Blackhawks to give up. Well, they're also trading up from number 19 to number 11 in a really good NHL draft. I personally would be willing to give up number 19 and a late second-round pick to take on Brock Besser and to go and get that 11th overall selection. I don't know if that's a good enough deal. You might feel however you want to about that, but I do think there is an opportunity for the Blackhawks to trade up here at number 11. Sounds like the Canucks aren't quite as desperate as they once were, but they're still in a financial dark spot at this point in time. So I do think there is still a chance that the Blackhawks and the Canucks get something done here. And out of all their options of trading up, I think this one might be the most likely. Two other teams I wanted to throw out there as well. The Pittsburgh Penguins, who have the 14th overall selection. They also are in a very tough spot financially at this point in time. They got a lot of guys they got to bring back. Brian Rust is one of the most notable. They got some tough decisions to make about their future, and just not a whole lot of flexibility in order to do so. So I do wonder if Pittsburgh would be willing to trade back from 14 to 19 if the Blackhawks could help them shed some salary. And one player that's been thrown around a bunch this offseason and a lot of those deals has been Mikael Granlund, who signed on for 2 more years at $5 million. Not a good deal to have on the Pens book at this point in time. I think it's fairly likely that the Pens and the Hawks make a deal out of all the teams for the Blackhawks to trade up with. I think outside of Vancouver, Pittsburgh makes the most sense given their current situation. And I think, look, the Blackhawks trading up from 19 to 14 while taking on Granlund's contract, I think that's probably good enough considering how tough of a spot the Penguins are in at this point in time. I also think the Calgary Flames could be an interesting option at number 16. They're also in one of the toughest spots financially. You see a common theme here. A lot of these teams just don't have a lot of wiggle room, but the Blackhawks do. That's what they have going in their favor. And while the Flames are only 3 spots ahead of the Blackhawks, I do wonder if this is an opportunity for the Blackhawks. If someone they like is still on the board there, maybe they trade up with the Flames at number 16. I've thrown Andrew Mangiapane's name out there a bunch this offseason. He's got 2 years left on his current deal at $5.8 million. Quite honestly, though, the one thing I've thought about, I don't know if 3 spots is enough for the Blackhawks to trade up for that deal. And look, maybe it is. Maybe they're fine with doing that. But I feel like they almost could get more out of Calgary for taking on that contract of Mangiapane at nearly $6 million over the next 2 seasons, coming off a pretty down year for him as well as it was for the entire Calgary Flames squad. So maybe that's not exactly how the deal gets penciled in, but I think Andrew Mangiapane is an interesting name to keep an eye on at the draft or even throughout the rest of the offseason because of the price tag that's going along with his current contract. So those are all the current options I think the Blackhawks have of trading up from the 19th overall selection. We'll see if that ends up happening. As I mentioned, just doesn't sound like there's a lot of willing partners to trade back right now. But at the end of the day, a lot of these teams don't have money and don't have a lot of space to make things happen in the offseason. So I wouldn't be too surprised if we see one of them having to make the tough decision of trading back to the Chicago Blackhawks. All right, coming up in just a moment here, Hawks fans, don't go anywhere because I'll talk about some possible selections for the Blackhawks, my favorite picks that they could make if they do wind up staying home at number 19. But first, I need to talk to you all about eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. And it's actually the same thing when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time that you need parts or accessories, make sure to head on over to eBay Motors because with eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to the My Garage feature and look for the green check mark to know the part will fit or else you'll get your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. So get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Real quick, if you haven't done so already, you're still tuned in to this point of the video. First, let me say thank you very much, and make sure to go and hit that subscribe button for me, folks. I'm currently on the road to 1,000 subscribers. We've been jumping up those numbers in the last few months, ever since really the Blackhawks won the Connor Bedard sweepstakes. I've been seeing a lot of growth and viewership, which I greatly appreciate. Thank you all so much for tuning into these episodes every day. You really keep me motivated to keep on grinding and pumping out videos. That's why I think all week I'm basically going to be having at least one episode, if not two, like I am today, coming out. So please make sure to go and show some support to the channel. Smash that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. And plus, once I do reach 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, I'm going to be having a cool giveaway, which I'll tell you about a little bit later on in the show. But picking up where I left off, I did want to be sure to mention, as I've broken down basically all the draft profiles that I've wanted leading up to the 2023 NHL Draft. Of course, I'll be wrapping up today's episode with Brayden Yager's draft profile. I believe I will have one more coming out tomorrow. But for the most part, out of the players that I think were likely for the Blackhawks to select, if they do stay home at number 19 or if they do trade up in the first round, for the most part, I've covered them. And I wanted to talk about some of my personal favorites and the guys that I would be wanting them to select if they do wind up staying home at number 19, which, as I talked about in segment 1, as much as Kyle Davidson, I think, is going to push the envelope and he's going to do his best to maximize on this opportunity to make a huge impact in the 2023 NHL Draft, it's just going to be tough. It's going to be really hard in order to make things work. I'm not going to count it out, but I'm not going to say it's an absolute slam dunk that the Blackhawks are going to move up from number 19. So, for the sake of conversation, getting into some of my favorite prospects that I've broken down here on Locked On Blackhawks over the last couple of months. Personally, I've kind of broken it down into my 5 favorites who I'd want them to select at number 19. Number 1, I'm just going to throw it out there, is not an option. It would only be a possibility if the Blackhawks were to trade up at number 8, and quite honestly, this guy might already be off the board at that point in time. It's Ryan Leonard from the United States Development Program. That was the best prospect I've broken down on the show by far in my mind. But the next 5 that I do think have a decent chance of being there at number 19, in no particular order at this point in time, I have, because I'm going to be releasing my order later on in the week, probably tomorrow since the draft's on Wednesday. But the 5 guys that I like the most that I broke down were Colby Barlow, Matthew Wood, Gabe Perreault, Nate Danielson, and Samuel Honzek. Those were the 5 players that I would be the most intrigued by for the Blackhawks to take at number 19. And I think one thing to think about here with the 19th overall selection, I really do expect the Blackhawks to take a forward, given all the defensemen that they have in their system. While there is a little bit of a gap on the right side, I still think as a whole, their defensive prospect pool is pretty deep, and I'm sure they'd like to add some more depth to the forward position in the entire organization, because while it is a deeper prospect pool than we've seen in quite some time at the forward position, most of them are still out of the 2022 NHL Draft. So you're still going to want to deepen the prospect pool over these next few years, and forward is the position where the Blackhawks, I think we can all agree, need the most help at this point in time. So I really expect them to take a forward at number 19. And I also wouldn't be surprised if, while we've heard how they're going to be focusing on skaters and guys who think the game at a high level and have really good IQs and all that stuff, I also think this is a pretty good time for the Blackhawks to add a forward prospect with some good size, or at least someone who plays a sizable game. Like, thinking about all the forwards they have in the organization, Connor Bedard is not a big kid. Lucas Reichel is not a big kid. Frank Nazar is not a big kid. Like, they have a lot of smaller forward prospects, and I wouldn't be surprised if they wanted to add someone with a high ceiling that also has some size and maybe some physicality that they can bring, because it's one thing you notice when you watch the Stanley Cup playoffs. You got to be tough, you got to be rugged, and having size is pretty gosh darn important. So based on what the Blackhawks have in their forward prospect pool right now, wouldn't be surprised if they took someone with size and skill at the 19th overall pick. I think Matthew Wood is probably, if I had to guess, the one out of those five that I just broke down who has the best chance of being available at number 19. I don't think Colby Barlow is going to make it to number 19. I don't think Gabe Perreault makes it there. Nate Danielson is going to be really interesting because I absolutely love Nate Danielson, and he's kind of been all over the place as far as mock drafts. If he falls to the Blackhawks, man, I'd be thrilled to have that kid come to our prospect pool. I'd be thrilled to have Samuel Honzek as well, a kid who skates really well for being 6'3", 6'4", has a really strong shot, really good hands. Samuel Honzek was actually who I selected with the 19th overall pick a couple of weeks ago during my Locked On NHL mock draft. And that's because Colby Barlow, Matthew Wood, Gabe Perreault, and Nate Danielson were all gone at that point in time. So I elected to take Samuel Honzek, and I think he would be a good fit to the organization as well. Any of those five, personally, to me, are ideal fits for the Blackhawks at number 19. Those are kind of how I shake things out in terms of my top five. Some other players that I think, there's really only two other guys that I'd consider with the 19th overall pick. For me, it's Riley Heidt, and quite honestly, this is where it becomes tough in such a deep NHL draft. Riley Heidt's projected by some draft scouts and some websites to go into the second round. Now, if that's the case, if the Blackhawks are getting that feel that no one really has interest in Riley Heidt, maybe they do take a chance and wait on him and see if he's available in the second round. Or maybe they try to trade back up into the first round to get him, which I'll get there in just a second. That's kind of the tough part about some of these guys who are projected to go in the mid to late first round. It can really go any way, but I personally really liked Riley Heidt's game. The guy who I'm going to be breaking down tomorrow, just a little bit of foreshadowing. I apologize to all my listeners out there. Quentin Musty, if he's available at number 19, I think Heidt and Musty are the two guys outside of that top five. If all of them are already gone come number 19, those would be the two prospects that I'm looking at taking next. What I wanted to get into, though, before I wrap up segment 2, are some potential prospects worth trading into the late first round for. And I will say, I also think this would be a very complicated matter for the Blackhawks, given how deep this first round is, yes, and just kind of how, based on like what I said, I don't know if very many teams are going to be wanting to trade draft capital at this point in time. It might have to be more so the Blackhawks doing them a favor, or by taking on that salary or giving them a later pick. I think that's how things are going to shape out later here in the first round, if a team like the Blackhawks does wind up trading back into it. But there's really only a couple of prospects, like I said, that I'd be willing to trade back into the first round for. That would be Riley Heidt, it would be Quentin Musty, and I'd consider trading back into the first round for Gavin Brindley as well. The rest of them, I'd take my chances and see if they're going to be there. Well, man, this is really bad that I'm forgetting this off the top of my head. Now I got to look up Blackhawks draft picks. So they have 35. So they have number 35. I apologize, folks. This is terrible of me. I should have had it written down. Anyways, regardless, I think there's only a couple of guys that realistically, and this is, again, only I think if the Blackhawks absolutely love somebody, would they be willing to give up stuff, considering they do have a higher draft pick. Man, this is really irking me that I can't find this one I need to the most. Doesn't it always seem like it works that way? Oh, well. Regardless, I think there are only a couple of options potentially for them to trade up at. I think number 22 with the Philadelphia Flyers could be a possibility. We've heard rumors that they're trying to be very active. They obviously have a whole new front office with Keith Jones, Danny Briere, our boy Patrick Sharp, of course, is joined not all that long ago. By the way, the Blackhawks do have the 35th overall selection. Throw my phone away. Tried to figure that out for 10 minutes there, basically, but now I don't even remember where I was going with that point. Considering the Blackhawks have picked number 35, that's where I was going. Maybe they don't want to trade up, and maybe they're just willing to wait. So I do think trading up from 19 is probably more likely than trading back into the first round. But just for the sake of an offseason conversation, here are some possibilities for the Blackhawks. I mentioned the Flyers at number 22, given they're kind of trying to go in a new direction. I don't know if they're willing to trade everybody on their roster or whatnot, but there are rumors that they are expected to be very active. I wonder if a player like Scott Lawton could be someone they'd move and part ways with. He does have 3 years left on his current deal, though, which isn't ideal for GM Kyle Davidson, but only a $3 million cap hit, which could change his mind. The Rangers at number 23 could be an option if they're trying to be very active this offseason, like we expect them to be. They obviously have notable unrestricted free agents. It's going to be interesting to see what kind of moves they make. I brought up Barclay Goodrow as being one of the worst contracts in the NHL and possibly a contract the Blackhawks would be willing to take on with 4 years left on that contract. I just personally don't see that happening. So number 23 for the Rangers probably isn't very likely. The Blues have pick numbers 25 and 29 here late in the first round. There have been some rumors that they possibly may be willing to move from one of those. I know we don't see interdivision trades go on very often, at least, so I'm not going to say that this is likely, but given all the buzz around the Blues at this point in time, and they're in a tough financial spot as well, I don't think it's the craziest thing in the world. I think the Toronto Maple Leafs, though, are the team that makes the most amount of sense for the Blackhawks to trade back into the first round with, like we saw them do last year when they took on Peter Mrazek's contract. And that's because the Toronto Maple Leafs are in an interesting spot. They don't have any second round picks for the next 3 years, and they also don't have a pick in rounds 2, 3, or 4 this year. So after their one first round selection at number 28, they're not picking again until round 5. So I do wonder if the Blackhawks offer them a second round selection or maybe a second and a third in this year's draft. Maybe they could move up from number 35 to number 28 or somewhere in the second round up to number 28. I think just given how little of draft capital the Toronto Maple Leafs have, they might be willing to take on that type of deal. We've obviously seen these teams make a couple of trades in the past year. So I think if the Blackhawks are going to try to trade up back into the first round for a third first round selection, the Toronto Maple Leafs are the most likely potential suitor in order to make a deal with. All right, coming up in just a moment here, Hawks fans, don't go anywhere. I still have to get into forward Brayden Yager's 2023 NHL Draft profile. All right, folks, welcome back to the Locked On Blackhawks podcast. After today's show, be sure to go and check out Locked On's 2023 NHL Mock Draft Special. The local hosts, including none other than yours truly, have made their picks, and Locked On NHL will break down every selection over a 3-day mock draft event. Find the episodes on Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. All right, before I wrap things up, it's time to get into my next 2023 NHL Draft profile. I believe the second last one I'll be getting into before things get underway on Wednesday night. Today, of course, as you all know by the title, I'll be covering 18-year-old forward prospect Brayden Yager, a 6-foot, 165-pound forward that played for the Moose Jaw Warriors of the WHL the last 3 seasons. And by the way, if you want to go and check out certain prospects, some of the guys that I just named in segment 2 can easily do so by checking out my YouTube channel. I have a playlist of 2023 NHL draft profiles, and with every episode, everything's time coded in the description, so you can easily jump on over to that. And make sure to go and smash that subscribe button, smash that like button while you're there. I greatly appreciate all the support as always, folks. I've gone over so many prospects: Ryan Leonard, Gabe Perreault, Colby Barlow, Matthew Wood, Gavin Brindley, Daniil Boot, Dalibor Dvorsky, Riley Height, Callum Ritchie, Samuel Hanzak, and most recently up until today, Nate Danielson, who is one of the most intriguing prospects in my mind in this year's draft class. Anyways, getting into Brayden Yager, he's coming off a season in which he tallied 78 points, 28 goals, and 50 assists in 67 games for the Moose Jaw Warriors. That was good for 7th in terms of points per game among all draft eligible players in the WHL. But kind of the interesting thing I noticed when looking at a quick breakdown of Brayden Yager's stats is what he put up the year prior, because in 63 games, he had 34 goals and 25 assists for 59 points the year before. But it seems like this past season, he took on a little bit more of a a playmaking role and a little bit more of an all-around game as opposed to being just a goal scorer the year prior. So while we did see him drop down from 34 goals to 28, there was a noticeable jump in terms of the assists, up from 25 to 50. He doubled his total this past season and rounded out his game by becoming a little bit more of a better passer. And then he also ended the year on a really high note by tallying 16 points in just 10 postseason games for Moose Jaw. That was second in the WHL, second in terms of points per game in the WHL playoffs, trailing only, that Connor Bedard kid who we're going to be picking number 1 overall here in just a couple of days. But yeah, ended the season on a really high note, did Brayden Yager. And I think that's kind of helped boost his draft stock a little bit over the last couple of months. And it has kind of been talked about a lot as potentially a sleeper that hasn't been talked about enough going into this year's draft class. But all in all, while I did see that uptick in playmaking from Brayden Yager this past season, when taking a deeper dive into his game, watching some of the film, some of his highlights, I do think he's probably going to be a better goal scorer than he will be a playmaker. I think he's going to be more of a sniper at the professional level, if I had to guess, because he has an excellent release. And, well, again, while I said he went down from 34 goals last year to 28 this season, I think that's just the role that he took on this year, because watching this kid shoot the puck, my, oh my, an excellent release, super powerful, great precision, excellent mechanics. He can absolutely fire it by you. And I think that's probably going to be his best offensive attribute at the next level, if I had to guess. And again, while he did round out his game in terms of the playmaking ability, there isn't really anything that stands out. It's not like he's super creative or super flashy. I think he makes the simple plays. He has good hockey IQ. He makes good reads, and it makes these, I think the best part of his passing ability are the quick little passes that he makes, mostly because he's reading the game at a high level and understanding what's going to be open in front of him. But I don't think there's anything exceptional about his playmaking ability. I think that's why, to me, the goal scoring is always going to be the thing that's going to be getting him by at the next level. He also doesn't pair it with anything special, right? Like, he doesn't have game-breaking speed. He's kind of just an average skater in this year's draft class. He also doesn't have the best puck control or the best hands. It's almost like, aside from the shot, the rest of his offensive game is just kind of meh. Now, there's still certainly room for him to develop it. He's already got that shot part down, but I do wonder how high his ceiling will be, because he's not the best skater, the best stick handler, not a great dangler, and just all around not the most creative player, certainly, that I've broken down here ahead of the 2023 NHL draft. And also, with those concerns about the playmaking, I do wonder if he's able to play center at the next level, because being more of a goal scorer, you might want him actually on the wing where he's controlling the puck less. And when he does control it, he's going to have more opportunities to shoot. But at the same time, one of the biggest strengths of Brayden Yager's game is how his compete level is so solid, how good of a back checker he is. He's already known as a reliable two-way center who brings it each and every shift. And that's kind of what makes you feel like he's a safe bet to be an NHLer, is because he kind of has those intangibles. That's why most folks have him penciled in as a first-round pick. But the debate really is, how high do you think his ceiling will be, a.k.a. how high do you think he'll go in the draft? So that's kind of where there's a lot of different opinions on Brayden Yager. There have been rankings all over the place. He was ranked as high as 10th by the Hockey News and as low as 33rd by Dobber Prospects. Are the only ones to have him going outside of the first round. So seems likely he's going to be in the top 32, but no one really knows where it's going to be. Again, the Hockey News, had him 10th. Chris Peters had him ranked 14th. Bob McKenzie had him 15th. Sportsnet had him at 17. Craig Button had him at 18. Elite Prospects ranked him 22nd. The Daily Face-Off, the Faley Days-Off, that would be funny. Maybe that's my spoof podcast that I'll make. The Faley Days-Off. The Daily Face-Off had him at 24th. McKean's Hockey had him at 30th. And then, as I mentioned, the only one to have him outside of the first round was Dobber Prospects. As far as getting a breakdown of his strengths and weaknesses, I really do think that Yager has one of the best shots outside of the top 5 prospects that I've broken down. The form is excellent. The power is there. The precision, the accuracy. I really think he's going to be a 30 goal scorer at the next level because of that shot. I also think he already knows how to make an impact in all three zones. He's defensively responsible. He's looking to make an impact on the defensive side of things. In terms of his playmaking, I think the best part of it is the quick passes and the reads that he makes in transition or in tight when he has an open teammate. And just his all-around game recognition and his hockey IQ is at a high level, absolutely. As far as the weaknesses, I do think he's just kind of an average skater. There's not elite top-end speed, and I don't know if he's going to be a mail lugger at the NHL level. I also don't think there's anything in terms of off the charts in the playmaking categories. He does also need to put on a lot of weight if he does want to be a successful defensive center at the NHL level. Being 165 pounds ain't going to cut it. And also there's the question of, does he have the playmaking even to be playing down the middle? If so, you might have the ceiling of a third liner maybe. So just not necessarily, in my opinion, at least. Look, there's a lot of varying opinions out there, but in my opinion, I just don't necessarily see Brayden Yager having the ceiling as I see in some of these other guys, in a Quentin Musty, who I'll break down tomorrow, in a Nate Danielson, in a Matthew Wood, in a Gabe Perreault, Colby Barlow, even Riley Heidt, in my opinion. I think all those players have far higher upsides than Brayden Yager, because the playmaking is just a little bit of a worry to me. So as far as my consensus, I'm probably not as high on Brayden Yager as some people are, and I think he'll probably end up going somewhere in the 20s if I had to guess. I personally wouldn't be willing to take him at number 19. I think he projects as a middle six goal-scoring winger who can be steady on the defensive side of things as well. He is versatile and probably will be able to play all three forward positions. I do think there's a chance he could be a power play one guy because of his shot. And like I mentioned, I do think he could be a 30 goal scorer. He just lacks creative upside in my mind. So he's not a pick for me at number 19, but will be fascinating, like a lot of these prospects, to see where Brayden Yager does end up going in the 2023 NHL Draft. All right, folks, I think that's going to wrap up Monday, June 26th episode of Locked On Blackhawks. As always, thank you all again for tuning into the show, and be sure to go and follow Locked On Blackhawks right now, wherever you may be listening to your podcast, and to go and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube. And that way you can get the latest episode as soon as it becomes available each and every day. Once again, I'm your host, Jack Bushman. Find me out on Twitter at Jack Bushman2, or you could also go and follow my Strictly Blackhawks account at Talkin' Hockey for all the latest Blackhawks news and updates. So until tomorrow's episode, it's going to do it here for the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.